At just 28, Maya Miller carries more weight than most people face in a lifetime. A single mother, widowed, raising twin boys while working in the mansion of a man feared for his coldness. James Harrison, billionaire, brilliant and broken. He's fired everyone who failed to meet his impossible standards, and Maya knows one mistake could cost her everything. But one unexpected morning when she brings her babies to work out of desperation, the unthinkable happens. The coldest man she's ever met kneels to the floor and lets her child call him Dad. What starts as survival becomes something far deeper. But when past wounds return and old enemies surface, will this fragile bond survive? Stay with us. You won't believe where this story goes. Maya Miller tightened the straps on the baby carrier with trembling fingers, glancing down at Ryan and Alex, who blinked up at her from their strollers with the unbothered calm of children, unaware of adult crisis. The message from the daycare had arrived just after dawn. Emergency closure. Sorry for the inconvenience. Inconvenience didn't even begin to cover it. Her shift at the Harrison estate started in an hour, and she knew from whispered stories among the staff that Mr. James Harrison didn't tolerate personal problems. The man had fired a housekeeper once for forgetting to align the silverware with surgical precision. Maya couldn't afford a single misstep, not after the months of unemployment that followed David's death. Not with rent looming like a guillotine and formula cans down to their last scoops. So she made a decision, one born not from recklessness, but from desperation. She dressed the boys, packed their snacks, and promised them an adventure. As the cab approached the mansion's gates, a sinking guilt knotted in her stomach. She wasn't just breaking the rules. She was gambling, the only stable ground left beneath her feet. By the time she stepped inside the mansion, her hands were already damp with sweat. She moved swiftly, pushing the stroller toward the laundry room tucked behind the eastern corridor, a forgotten nook near the utility sinks and old shelving units. The boys cooed and clapped, amused by the echoes their voices made off the tiled walls. "Shh, baby, shh," Maya murmured, pressing a finger to Alex's lips and fishing a soft rubber tether from the diaper bag. She crouched beside them, brushing Ryan's curls off his forehead. "Mama's got to work, okay, just for a few hours." She whispered it more to herself than to them. Then she left them there, baby gate propped in the doorway, cartoons queued up on her phone, perched against a detergent bottle. She began her routine with surgical precision. Fluff the pillows in the sitting room, dust the banister, mop the floors without leaving a single streak. She was focused, almost robotic, her ears tuned like antennae to the faintest sounds. Every few minutes she'd peek back, sigh in relief at their giggles, and resume her tasks. She thought she was pulling it off until she heard the unmistakable creak of the front door. James Harrison didn't return early. That was the rule. He worked 18-hour days, often disappeared on business trips, and valued distance more than conversation. So, when Maya heard the sharp click of Italian leather shoes crossing the foyer, her stomach plunged. She turned the corner just in time to see him walking toward the living room, briefcase in hand, jaw set in its usual grim line, and beyond him the unmistakable sound of something clanking. Not mechanical, not architectural, something playful. "Oh, no," she whispered under her breath, bolting into motion. But it was too late. James had reached the living room, and the scene had already unfolded before him. There, in the middle of the sprawling marble floor, sat Ryan and Alex, surrounded by a chaos of kitchen lids and plastic containers. The babies were squealing, pounding on overturned bowls like drum kits, clapping and laughing as if the cold floor were a concert stage. James stopped dead. His eyes, sharp as cut glass, widened, not with surprise, but with a kind of dawning confusion that quickly twisted into fury. Maya reached the archway just as his head turned. Their eyes met. Hers screamed, "Please don't." His said nothing, just silence and steel. James opened his mouth, a sharp breath, the beginning of what she knew would be a firing. But then something happened. Ryan, curious as ever, dropped his makeshift drumstick and crawled toward the towering man in the suit. The marble was slick beneath his knees, but the little boy pushed forward with unshaken determination. James blinked, stunned, as the toddler reached him, sat up on chubby legs, and held out his arms. "Dada!" The word came out soft and slurred, barely more than a syllable, but it froze the room. Maya's heart stopped. She watched, horrified, expecting James to recoil or explode, but instead he laughed. A real laugh, not polite or measured, but involuntary and almost confused, as if the very sound had surprised him. He crouched, slow and cautious, and let the little boy grab his index finger. James's expression shifted. Something tender flickered behind his eyes. Something that looked dangerously like memory. For a man who built empires on logic, the moment defied explanation. Maya clutched the wall behind her for balance, watching a man she had feared unravel in front of a child who had no idea who he was. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was intimate. Maya wanted to say something, anything to explain, to apologize, but the words died in her throat. James remained crouched, his attention now split between Ryan and Alex, who had scooted closer, offering him a dented pot lid like a gift. James accepted it with both hands as if handling something sacred. "Which one said that?" he asked quietly, glancing at Maya without breaking the boy's gaze. "Ryan," she replied, voice small. "I'm so sorry. The daycare. You didn't think to tell me," he interrupted, though his tone wasn't cruel. "I didn't want to lose the job. I didn't have a choice." Her voice cracked then, sharp with guilt. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he let Alex crawl into his lap and babble nonsense sounds while Ryan leaned against his shoulder. The baby's wholly trusting nestled into him without fear. James blinked slowly, his arms circling them in what began as hesitation and turned into instinct. "They're not a problem," he said. 3 words, simple and strange. But when Maya heard them, her knees nearly buckled. Maya didn't move. Her feet were rooted, her brain struggling to catch up with her heart. The man in front of her, who once terrified the staff with his cold stares and quiet dismissals, was now balancing 2 giggling babies on his lap and smiling not out of politeness or awkwardness, but something that looked like contentment. She watched him murmur something to Ryan, who giggled in response, and for the first time she saw warmth in James Harrison's eyes. Real warmth. There was something there. Not pity, not charity, but presence, connection. Maya felt her breath catch in her chest, and for a flicker of a second, the heaviness she'd carried for months lightened. David's absence, the overdue bills, the fear of eviction. They all took a step back as she stood in the doorway of a mansion she thought would never welcome her fully. She had walked in that morning expecting to mop floors in silence and hide her children like a secret. But now she was watching something she didn't understand but couldn't look away from. And the strangest part, James didn't seem to want to look away either. The laughter of her children filled the mansion like it belonged there, bouncing off walls that had never heard joy. And James stayed right where he was, letting them explore his face, tug his tie, and babble as if he'd always been part of their world. Maya didn't dare break the spell, the not yet. Her apology hung in the air, unfinished and now unnecessary. What she expected to be a catastrophe had shifted into something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for. She didn't trust it. Not yet. But she didn't run from it either. James glanced at her one more time, still holding both boys, like they were made of glass and stardust. And then it happened again. Ryan looked up, eyes wide and joyful, and repeated the word clearer this time. Da. James didn't laugh this time. He just closed his eyes, inhaled once, and let the word land where it would, and Maya, heart-pounding, stood motionless and wide-eyed, watching the impossible unfold. Maya stood frozen in the doorway, shoulders pulled back in a useless attempt at composure. Her mouth parted just enough to begin a rehearsed apology that now felt completely insufficient. Her mind raced through every possible consequence: termination, humiliation, blacklisting, while her eyes stayed locked on the man, sitting cross-legged on the floor. An image so foreign it made her doubt her own memory. James Harrison. The James Harrison was not standing over her with cold fury, not demanding an immediate explanation. He was just sitting with her children, letting them crawl onto his lap as if this were a routine part of his life. Alex pulled at his silk tie with wide-eyed fascination, while Ryan tried to wedge a pacifier into his mouth. James didn't flinch or push them away. He chuckled softly, awkwardly, and let them explore his presence with the curiosity only toddlers could get away with. It was disarming, surreal. Maya clenched her fists, unsure whether she should intervene or just let the moment stretch, hoping it didn't snap into something painful. James looked up, not with annoyance, but with something closer to calm exasperation. "You don't have to explain." His voice was low but clear, and that alone felt like a kind of miracle. Not once had she heard him speak without edge, without pressure to perform or get out of the way. "I know what emergencies look like," he added, lifting Ryan slightly as the child nestled into his side. Maya blinked, lips still parted, struggling to process not only the absence of anger, but the presence of something unexpectedly human. James Harrison was not exactly warm, not exactly gentle, but there was a restraint in him that didn't feel forced. He didn't hold her gaze long, but it lingered just enough to settle the panic rising in her throat. She stepped into the room cautiously, lowering her voice. "I promise this won't happen again. I just couldn't miss another shift. I couldn't afford. I said you don't have to explain." He repeated more firmly this time as he gently adjusted Alex's grip on his shirt buttons. "There. Not a problem." The way he said it slowly, like he was still figuring out if he meant it, hit her harder than any reprimand could have. She didn't know how to respond. That phrase, so simple, echoed louder than any angry tirade she'd imagined. "They're not a problem." It wasn't approval. It wasn't understanding either, but it was something enough to keep her rooted in place, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Maya knelt a few feet away, as if getting physically closer might make the situation more believable. She gently stroked Ryan's hair, watching him lean against James's chest with unnerving comfort. The man hardly knew her name 2 days ago. Now her sons were treating him like a second home. "They like you," she murmured, a strange mix of embarrassment and wonder in her tone. James didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I haven't spent much time around kids." He looked down at Alex, whose tiny fist was currently wrapped around 2 of his fingers. "They don't care who I am. That's unusual." Maya didn't know what to make of that. She almost asked why he came home early, what had changed, but something told her not to poke too hard at whatever had cracked open in him today. If the moment was delicate, she wasn't going to be the one to drop it. Minutes passed like that quietly. Maya sat beside her sons, not too close, not too far. James remained still, his usual tension oddly absent from his shoulders. The twins babbled and occasionally shrieked with laughter, as if unaware of how surreal their audience was. Maya took this lull as a chance to breathe, a real breath, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in weeks. Since David's death, everything had been survival. Diapers, bills, late-night crying, job applications, more rejections than she could count. When she finally got the call from the Harrison estate, she knew it wasn't ideal. The job was strict, the hours long, and the boss had the warmth of a locked freezer. But it was a paycheck, and she would have scrubbed every tile with a toothbrush if it meant keeping her boys fed. And now here they were on that same pristine tile floor, giggling like they were at home, while the man who paid her salary didn't seem to mind one bit. That unsettled her more than anything. James Harrison didn't do kindness, not from what anyone said. So why wasn't she fired yet? James eventually shifted, as if returning to reality from some unfamiliar dream. He carefully lowered Ryan back onto the blanket on the floor and brushed his hands together absently. "You should finish your tasks. I'm sure you've got a lot left to do." D. It wasn't cold, just matter of fact, almost like he didn't want to admit how long he'd been sitting there. Maya stood slowly, lifting Alex into her arms and signaling for Ryan to follow. "Of course, yes, thank you for... I appreciate." "You don't have to say thank you," James said without looking up. "I didn't do anything." That wasn't true. He had done something strange and meaningful that didn't fit into either of their lives as they knew them. But Maya didn't press it. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered the boys and tucked their things back into her bag. Ryan waved at James with a wet grin, and Maya half expected him to ignore it. But James raised a hand, just briefly, and Ryan beamed like it was the best thing that had ever happened. She left the mansion an hour later, long after finishing her tasks with mechanical focus, her thoughts stuck on a loop. The twins had fallen asleep in their car seats almost instantly, their heads tilted toward each other, cheeks flushed with joy. Maya couldn't shake the image of James on the floor, looking utterly lost and strangely found at the same time. He hadn't yelled, hadn't fired her, hadn't even warned her. He just stayed. That was the part she couldn't make sense of. Why did he stay? Why had he, a man with every reason to shut down, deflect, dismiss, let her sons crawl all over him like he was made of softness instead of steel? It didn't add up. Nothing about that afternoon did. And yet, as she drove home with the moon rising over the city skyline, Maya felt a flicker of something unfamiliar at the edges of her exhaustion. Not relief, not gratitude, something closer to curiosity, maybe even the beginning of trust. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight she wasn't fired. She was just held. And somehow that mattered more than she could explain. The changes didn't come with announcements or explanations. No notes pinned to the fridge. No awkward sit-downs with managerial phrasing, just little shifts in rhythm, subtle at first, then unmistakable. James started pushing his meetings later. Calls that once started at sunrise were delayed until noon. Memos were answered from home instead of the corner office that crowned a Manhattan tower. Maya didn't notice it the first few times, distracted by the constant demands of the twins and the unspoken pressure of working in a house where everything had to remain perfect. But then she began hearing footsteps during the day, his footsteps moving through the hallways when she used to think the house was hers alone. He never interrupted. Sometimes he'd pause at a doorway, watching without speaking. Other times he'd pass by, nodding slightly and greeting, eyes tired but not unkind. His presence, once imposing, became something she anticipated, not with dread, but with curiosity. The man who used to vanish like a ghost was now haunting in a different way, not cold, just present, and that in itself felt like the beginning of something neither of them had words for. The first time she noticed the real shift, she was folding towels in the laundry room. It was early, just after the twins had gone down for their morning nap. She'd always filled the silence with humming, mostly out of habit, though sometimes just to keep her emotions from slipping out unchecked. That day, it was an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing, low and sweet, a melody passed down like worn fabric. Her hands moved mechanically, matching the beat of her voice as she stacked neatly folded towels into the cabinet. She didn't hear him approach, but something shifted in the air, a kind of quiet that wasn't empty. When she turned, James was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely, his expression unreadable. She froze mid-verse, caught somewhere, between apology and embarrassment. But he didn't move, didn't smirk or comment. His eyes were half closed, like he'd been listening, really listening, and couldn't quite step away. "What song is that?" he asked after a moment. His voice was low, unguarded. Maya hesitated before answering. "Just something my grandma used to sing. Helps me think." He nodded once, then walked away, but not before saying, "You should keep singing." That night, the twins woke crying. It wasn't unusual when they were teething, both of them, and sleep came in short, fitful stretches. Maya padded into the kitchen in slippers and a robe, hair tied back in a loose bun. She moved with the familiarity of exhaustion, pouring milk into bottles and heating them over the stove with one hand while cradling Alex against her shoulder. Ryan had fallen back asleep after a few murmured reassurances, but Alex had a stubborn streak. She swayed slowly, singing that same lullaby, under her breath as the bottle warmed. And then she heard footsteps again, softer this time, measured. When she turned, James was there, standing awkwardly in the kitchen doorway like he wasn't sure whether to come in or leave. She didn't say anything, and neither did he at first. But then, without asking, he stepped forward and gestured toward the second chair at the small kitchen table. "Do you mind?" he asked, voice quiet. She shook her head, surprised. He sat just like that. No performance, no reason. Just a man sitting beside her in the middle of the night while she warmed milk for a crying baby. The silence between them was strangely comfortable. It wasn't like the silences they shared before. Those were tense, anticipatory, filled with the fear of making a wrong move. This one felt different. She passed him a clean burp cloth and said nothing. He took it without question. Alex, now calm, nestled into her chest with the warm bottle, eyes fluttering shut. James watched carefully as if the mechanics of love were something he'd never studied up close before. "How long has it been since?" He trailed off, not quite finishing the question. Maya glanced at him. 3 months car accident. He was coming home from work. I was making dinner. She swallowed, forcing the memory back where it belonged. James didn't respond with platitudes, didn't offer hollow sympathy. He just nodded slowly, like the weight of her loss had landed on his chest, too. "I was engaged once," he said after a while. "Years ago she left, said I wasn't built for love." The way he said it wasn't bitter, just factual, like a scar he'd learned to stop touching. Maya didn't press. She just kept rocking Alex, the warmth of the bottle mingling with the soft cadence of her breath. What passed between them wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. There was no grand confession or tearful breakdown. Just two people sitting side by side in the quiet of a mansion that had until recently only echoed with silence. He didn't touch her, didn't lean in, but he listened with the full presence of someone who rarely gave his attention away for free. And Maya, who'd spent so long keeping her pain tucked into tight corners of her chest, found herself speaking in full sentences for the first time in days. She told him about David, how they met in college, how he made her laugh during finals, how he once drove 4 hours just to bring her soup when she was sick. James listened like it mattered, like every Words she spoke filled a space he hadn't realized was empty. She didn't cry. He didn't comfort her. But something shifted again. The kind of shift you only notice later when you realize you've started breathing differently without knowing why. And when she finally stood to take Alex back upstairs, James didn't ask her to stay or follow her out. He just watched, eyes steady, as if committing something to memory. She paused at the door, looking back at him. He didn't speak, but there was something softened in his face, something human and tired and oddly peaceful. Maya didn't know what was happening between them, if anything was happening at all, but she knew this. Something had changed. And it wasn't the words. It was the listening, the lullaby, the shared ache that had no name. That night, he had found her in the kitchen warming milk and without asking sat beside her. She had told him about her husband, and he had listened, really listened. The warmth of the bottle, the melody of her voice, the shared absence of people they'd lost, it all melted into something unnamed, but growing. It started with something simple, a cleaning task, no different from the others Maya had done countless times since her first day in the mansion. She was in the master study, wiping down the heavy oak desk James rarely used, straightening pens he never touched, aligning books he never read. She'd done it a dozen times before, each time with the same quiet detachment, but today her cloth snagged slightly on the edge of the desk, revealing a drawer that hadn't been fully pushed in. A tiny silver key still jutted from the lock, as if someone had turned it halfway and forgotten to finish. She hesitated. Curiosity wasn't part of her job, but there was something about the drawer being left ajar, unintentional, vulnerable, that made her pause. Carefully she slid it open just enough to see what was inside. Only one item rested there, a single photograph dog-eared at the corners. It showed James years younger, his face less guarded, his smile less forced. He had his arm wrapped tightly around a woman, golden-haired, eyes full of light, whose smile was radiant and somehow unbearably tragic. On the back, written in faded black ink, was one name, Victoria. Maya didn't linger. She placed the photo, back exactly as she'd found it, pushed the drawer closed, and stepped away. But all afternoon her thoughts kept circling back to the image. That version of James, smiling, open, human, haunted her. She hadn't known him long, but she'd seen the layers, the guarded silences, the restraint he wore like armor. That photo didn't match the man who walked the halls like a shadow. That man had buried something, maybe more than one something. As she chopped vegetables in the kitchen later that day, trying to shake the image from her head, she heard footsteps, familiar now. Not alarming, just present. She didn't turn around immediately, assuming he would pass through like always, but he didn't. He stopped beside her, too close for it to be casual. She looked up, startled by the stillness in his expression. "You saw her," he said quietly, voice raw. No anger, just confirmation, not a question. Maya hesitated, then gave a small nod. She didn't offer excuses. She didn't lie, and he didn't accuse her. He simply leaned back against the counter, as if the act of standing had suddenly become too heavy. "I forgot the drawer wasn't locked," he said after a long silence. "No one's opened it in years." His hands were clenched at his sides, not in anger, but in the kind of restraint that came from deep emotional control. "Her name was Victoria," he continued, as if the photograph hadn't already told her. "She was my fiancée." Maya waited, not pushing, not prompting, just letting him speak. "The night my mother died, she left. I'd called her from the hospital, told her I needed her. She didn't come. I got home that night and found her bags gone." His voice cracked at the edge, just enough to make her chest tighten. She said she couldn't be with someone who was broken. That grief was too heavy for her. He didn't look at Maya as he spoke. His eyes were somewhere else, back in time, caught between memory and wound. Since then, I haven't let anyone in. Not really. Not because I don't want to, but because I don't trust that anyone stays. It wasn't a confession. It was a scar laid bare. Maya didn't respond right away. What could she say to undo that kind of hurt? Still, she felt her fingers twitch with the urge to reach out, not to fix him, not to promise anything, but just to say, "I hear you." She didn't, though. She wasn't ready for that. And maybe he wasn't either. Instead, she listened the way he'd listened to her in the kitchen just nights before. "The boys," James continued after a pause. "They don't know any of this. They just smile, laugh, climb all over me like I'm not this." He shook his head. "Like I'm not hollow." Maya stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "You're not hollow. You're hurting." He finally met her gaze, and the look in his eyes, vulnerable, stripped of all that careful detachment, almost broke her. "I don't know what to do with this feeling," he admitted. "With them, with you." Her breath caught. "You don't have to do anything," she said gently. "Just keep showing up." He gave a slight nod, then pushed away from the counter, retreating without another word. But the air between them was different now, changed. He had spoken his truth, and she had stayed. That night, Maya couldn't sleep. The twins, blissfully unaware of the emotional earthquakes around them, slept peacefully in their cribs. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing James's voice echo in her mind. "Since then, I haven't let anyone in." She thought of how easily Ryan had crawled into his lap, how Alex had smiled up at him like he'd been born knowing he could trust that man. Children didn't analyze or hesitate. They simply felt. And somehow they'd felt something in James worth believing in. Maya didn't know if she was falling for him. That word felt too big, too dangerous. But she knew this. She saw him, and he was trying. And in a world that had broken both of them in different ways, effort mattered. She reached for a notepad on the kitchen counter, the one she used for grocery lists, and tore off a small sheet. With a pen, she wrote slowly, deliberately, letting the words come not from hope or romance, but from honesty. The next morning, the note was there, centered neatly on the counter, where James would find it when he came down for his coffee. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. The message was simple, handwritten in quiet conviction. People break, but some people rebuild, not alone. Victoria Sterling didn't knock. She never had to. Her entrance into any room was less of a question and more of a declaration. One made in the click of heels, the turn of a sculpted shoulder, the calculated tilt of her head, as cameras followed. When she appeared that Thursday evening, stepping out of a sleek black car in front of James Harrison's mansion, it wasn't just a visit. It was a storm front rolling in. News had begun swirling days before. James Harrison seen with a woman and her children. Tabloids speculated, blogs gossiped. Victoria, watching it all from the quiet corners of Manhattan society, hadn't needed more than a headline. She knew the pattern. James didn't let people in. So if he had, it meant he was breaking. And James breaking meant one thing to her: opportunity. She arrived like she'd never left, draped in cream silk, eyes lined in vengeance disguised as poise. She kissed cheeks that didn't want her, and smiled at men who once feared her tongue. She wasn't here to rekindle. She was here to reclaim. Not James's heart, but his image, his power, his narrative. And if that meant cutting someone out, she'd wield the knife herself. The dinner party wasn't just a social gathering. It was a performance. Investors, media whisperers, elite donors from West Coast Ventures, and venture capitalists with too many opinions about the future of AI filled the mansion with the kind of sterile laughter James loathed. He played host with mechanical charm, pouring wine he didn't drink and nodding at predictions he didn't agree with. Maya, dressed in soft navy and quiet grace, moved in the background like she always did, unseen by most, but not by Victoria. She spotted her within minutes. No diamonds, no curated accent, just a woman with 2 children and no armor. It wasn't even a challenge. Victoria waited for her moment. When Maya passed through the butler's pantry, carrying a tray of delicate flutes, Victoria slipped in behind her like a shadow with teeth. "So," she said, smooth as the champagne in her hand, "you're the one they've all been whispering about." Maya turned, startled but composed. "Excuse me?" Victoria smiled without warmth. "James's charity project. The one with baggage." Maya's breath caught. "You don't know me." Victoria's voice dropped, slicing through any pretense. "No, darling, but I know him, and he always breaks the toys he thinks he can fix. You're not even porcelain." "You're a phase." Maya didn't reply. She couldn't, not with anything that wouldn't come out sounding defensive or worse, fragile. Instead, she walked past Victoria and placed the tray where it belonged, her hands steady, but her insides shaking. The words hit harder than she'd expected, not because she believed them, but because somewhere in the dusty corners of her doubt, they echoed whispers. She'd tried so hard to silence herself. "You don't belong here. You're temporary. He's going to remember who he is and who you're not." She kept working, robotically efficient, barely looking up when guests thanked her or smiled politely. James noticed he always noticed her now. From across the room, his eyes tracked the shift, the way her shoulders curled inward, how her voice dimmed. It wasn't just fatigue, it was something else. He excused himself from a conversation about market volatility and crossed the room without hesitation. "Maya," he said when he reached her near the side corridor. She turned, startled. "Yes?" His brow furrowed. "What happened?" She shook her head too quickly. "Nothing. I'm just tired. It's been a long day." But her eyes told a different story. James's jaw set. He turned away before she could protest, already knowing where to go. He found Victoria leaning against the marble island in the kitchen, swirling her wine as if she owned the place. "You spoke to her," he said flatly. Victoria didn't flinch. "I speak to lots of people. Don't play with me, Victoria." He stepped closer. "I know what you do when you feel like you're not in control. You find someone weaker and twist the knife." She tilted her head, all elegance and venom. "You think I see her as a threat." "Please, you should," he snapped. "She has more strength in her silence than you ever had in your performance." Victoria's smile faltered for half a breath. "You really believe this little nanny act is real? That she's not just playing house?" James leaned in. "If she is, she's doing it better than you ever could." Victoria's mask cracked just for a moment. Then, as always, she recovered. "You're emotional. That's new for you." He stepped back, calmer now, colder. "Leave, Victoria. Enjoy the party, but leave my life out of your theatre." She said nothing, but the chill in her gaze made it clear this wasn't over. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Maya. She went through the motions, kept the boys asleep in the nursery upstairs, cleaned up glassware, smiled when necessary. But her mind kept circling Victoria's words, the ones that tried to make her feel small, replaceable, foolish. When she finally slipped out to the garden to catch a breath of real air, James was already there, his jacket discarded over the back of a wrought-iron chair. "She's gone," he said without turning around. "I told her not to come back." Maya didn't respond. Not right away. You didn't have to. He looked at her then. Yes, I did. She swallowed, her throat tight. Why did she come? James hesitated, then said, because she heard something real was happening here. And Victoria doesn't believe in real unless she can control it. Maya nodded, understanding more than she wanted to. Did she lie? James's brows drew together. About what? About me being a phase. His jaw clenched. She doesn't get to define you or us. She nodded again, but the cracks had formed. Invisible. Hairline fractures that no one could see, but they were there. The doubt had been planted, and it would take more than words to erase it. And so the night ended as it began, with the seed of tension buried beneath silk and smiles. Victoria had denied everything. Of course, her words left no visible bruises, but Maya felt them anyway. James saw them. The world didn't know what had been said in that pantry, but Maya did, and Victoria did, and maybe now James did too. But the party was over, the guests gone, the wine glasses stacked and rinsed, and the seed Victoria planted, the one wrapped in poison and prediction, had taken root. The world was watching, and so was Maya. It started with something small, a murmur in the hallway, the kind of whisper that slips between closed doors and leaves a mark even when it has no shape. The silver pocket watch, James's father's, had gone missing from the glass display case in the study. No shattered lock, no broken hinge, just gone. At first, James assumed it had been moved for cleaning. He asked casually. No one admitted to touching it. Then Victoria, smooth as ever, made an offhand remark to one of the kitchen staff. Strange, isn't it? Things only started disappearing after the boys showed up, or maybe their mother needed help making ends meet. It wasn't a direct accusation. Victoria was too clever for that. But the effect was immediate. The words spread like oil through the mansion's silent machinery. Suddenly, glances lingered on Maya. Voices dropped when she entered the room. James didn't see it at first. He was too busy, too distracted, too unaware of how loud silence can be when it's directed at someone who has no armor. But Maya felt it. She felt it in the way the house stopped being home and became something else, a place where she didn't know who to trust. Maya tried to brush it off. She focused on the twins, on her tasks, on keeping the routine steady. But routine doesn't hold against suspicion. One afternoon, returning from changing Alex's diaper, she found her locker pried open in the staff quarters, clothes scattered, her wallet emptied and left face up. A crumpled photo of her late husband, the only copy she had, lay torn at the corner. She stood there for a long time, staring at the mess, as if it might rearrange itself and take back what it had done. When she reported it to the head of staff, the response was, "Kurt, we're looking into it." No apology, no reassurance, just sterile distance. Later that same day, she was pulled aside by Mr. Thompson, James's estate manager. He didn't meet her eyes. "Ms. Miller, given the current situation, we think it's best if you take some time away, until things are sorted." The words didn't surprise her. Not after the locker, not after the stairs. Still, they struck deep. She packed slowly. The boys were confused. Ryan asked for Mr. James 3 times while Maya folded their clothes. Alex clung to her leg. She kept her expression still, even when her hands trembled. She wouldn't cry. Not in this house, not in front of them. She left a note on the fridge, not for closure, but for clarity. It read, "I didn't take it, but I understand why no one believes me." She pinned it with a magnet shaped like a strawberry, one Ryan had loved to pull off every morning. Then she gathered the boys and walked out the side entrance without telling anyone. She didn't want goodbyes. She didn't want another hollow explanation about protocols or reputation or discretion. James wasn't home when she left. Maybe that made it easier, or maybe not. The cab she called took forever to arrive. She sat on the stone bench near the gate, Alex asleep on her shoulder, Ryan tugging at a loose thread on her sleeve. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence between them was heavy with what she couldn't say. That the world often didn't need proof to punish people like her. That being close to something beautiful didn't make you belong. That trust, once cracked, wasn't easily resealed. She told herself she'd find another job, another place. But the truth was, she'd begun to believe in something here, and now she wasn't sure if that belief had been her mistake. When James returned that evening, he noticed it immediately. The sound or lack of it. No soft thump of feet, no cooing from the nursery monitor, no hum from the kitchen. The house felt wrong, not empty, just off-kilter. He walked past the living room and saw the basket of toys untouched, a sippy cup forgotten on the end table. The baby monitor light blinked but transmitted nothing. He called out once, then twice. No answer. Thompson emerged from the corridor, stiff-backed. "She's gone," he said. "Took the boys and left this afternoon." James's chest tightened. "Why?" Thompson hesitated. "There was a situation. The watch went missing. Tensions rose. We thought it best if she—" "Who's we?" James's voice was razor-sharp. "Now, who gave the order?" Thompson shifted, uncomfortable. It wasn't an order, just a suggestion. James didn't speak again. He turned and walked into the kitchen, heart thudding. The silence pressed in, and the walls felt smaller. Then he saw it, the note, still pinned under the strawberry magnet. He pulled it free, eyes scanning the short sentence once, then again. Each word landed like a stone in his gut. He sat down at the counter, the paper still in his hand. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, neat, slanted slightly to the right, the ink darker where she'd pressed harder. "I didn't take it, but I understand why no one believes me." Simple, devastating. It wasn't just a denial, it was surrender, and it tore through him more than any confession could have. He thought of Ryan calling him Dada, of Alex reaching for his finger, of Maya humming in the laundry room, folding towels like it was an act of grace. He remembered how she never asked for anything, never demanded space, never once used her pain as a shield, and he had let them, cast her out like she was disposable. His hands tightened around the note. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was failure. His. He didn't know where she'd gone. He didn't know how to make it right. But he knew one thing with aching certainty. The house now was too quiet, not peaceful, not calm, just quiet. And that silence, the one she had once filled with lullabies and laughter, was unbearable. So he stood there still holding the note, the house swallowing him whole. The boys' toys remained scattered untouched. The kitchen, once warm with movement and smell, was still. The strawberry magnet rested on the counter, fallen from its place. And as James looked around at the life that had briefly bloomed in his home and now vanished, he understood what Victoria never could, that this hadn't been about charity or impulse. It had been something real, and now it was gone. He read the note one last time, and his heart split. James Harrison's world didn't go quiet. It went hollow. The kind of stillness that doesn't soothe, but unsettles. Days passed in slow, uneven hours. He moved through them like a man waking from anesthesia, aware but dulled. Meetings were missed, meals untouched, and for the first time in his adult life, he forgot passwords. His staff grew nervous but didn't dare ask. James didn't yell or rage. He didn't say much of anything. But the absence of two small voices had unraveled something foundational inside him. The echo of their laughter, their babbling, their feet, pattering across tile, haunted him more than silence ever had. The toys remained untouched in the corner of the living room. Every time he passed them, he stopped. Once he knelt beside Ryan's favorite truck and turned its wheels gently, as if the sound might summon the boy who used to crash it against his shoes with glee. It didn't. James stood and walked away. The house, for all its size, felt tight around him, like it was exhaling loss. And no matter how long he stared at the note on his desk, Maya's handwriting, clear and careful, the weight of its truth didn't lessen. She'd left, and this time he knew it wasn't because she wanted to. It was Thompson who found the watch. James didn't even react when the estate manager entered his office, silver glint in hand. "We found it," he said quietly, placing the object on the edge of the desk, like it might shatter. Under the floorboard in the north hallway, lightly dropped by the child. James's eyes snapped up. Which hallway? Near the piano room. There was a loose panel. It must have slipped through. Thompson cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "It was no one's fault, sir. I believe the child had it in hand. Crawled there, perhaps. The timing lines up." James picked up the watch slowly, fingers brushing over its surface like it might burn him. "The child," he repeated, voice. "Ryan." Thompson gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." James didn't thank him. He didn't scold him either. He stood, took the watch, and left without another word. For the first time in years, he walked away from business obligations and didn't look back. Every mile he drove toward Maya's neighborhood, his grip on the steering wheel tightened, not out of anger, but regret. Deep, clawing regret. He hadn't just failed to defend her. He'd believed the worst. Even for a moment, even with hesitation, it was enough to break something sacred. And that knowledge sat heavier than anything Victoria could have ever orchestrated. The apartment building was modest, old brick and rusting rails. It didn't matter. It was hers. He climbed the steps without knocking, holding the watch in his palm like a peace offering. He rehearsed what to say and realized too late that no words would be enough. When the door opened, Maya's face appeared first, tired, guarded. Then he saw Alex wrapped against her chest, his tiny body feverish and flushed. James didn't speak immediately. He couldn't. The words in his throat weren't strong enough to meet the moment. Instead, he held out the watch. No preamble, no dramatic apology, just truth, just action. "Come home," he said quietly, voice thinner than he intended. Maya's eyes flicked from the watch to his face. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. What she said was worse. "You believed I could do it," she whispered, her voice low, raw. That's what hurt the most. James's lips parted, but nothing came. What excuse could absolve that? What explanation mattered now? He didn't try to offer one. Instead, he stepped inside slowly, took off his coat, and sat on the floor beside her couch without asking permission. She watched him, uncertain. He said nothing further. Minutes passed, maybe more. Maya sat down too, Alex still clinging to her. The baby whimpered, restless, his skin too warm. James reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a small bottle of water. "It's cool," he said finally. "Can I?" Maya hesitated, then nodded. He poured a small amount into the cap and gently held it to the child's lips. Alex drank. Not much, but enough. His breathing slowed. James remained crouched, eyes never leaving the boy. He didn't reach for Maya. He didn't try to fix the conversation or spin it with logic. He simply stayed. His silence wasn't avoidance. It was presence. He knew he couldn't rewind time. He couldn't erase the betrayal or the way the world had cornered her. But he could be there now. And sometimes staying was louder than any apology. Maya watched him with cautious eyes, still nursing the sting of being cast out like a suspect. But some small part of her, buried beneath exhaustion and disappointment, saw the man before her, unguarded, stripped of wealth and reputation, just a man with a mistake and a willingness to be still in its aftermath. Alex finally fell asleep, his fever breaking slightly. Maya carried him to the small bedroom and laid him next to Ryan, who stirred but didn't wake. When she returned to the living room, James was still sitting there, elbows on knees, the watch resting in his palm. He hadn't moved. "You could have just called," she said, not bitter, just tired. James nodded. "I did. You didn't answer." She gave a faint shrug. "I didn't want to hear excuses." He looked up and his eyes, usually so unreadable, were full of something she couldn't name. "I don't have excuses," he said. "Just this." He gestured around, helpless. "The boys don't laugh in the house anymore. Neither do I." She lowered herself onto the armrest, arms crossed. "That's not my fault." "I know," he said quickly. "I know that now." The silence that followed wasn't bitter. It wasn't easy either. But it was real, and real was all they had. They didn't speak again for a while. James stayed until Alex's breathing was steady, and then only then did he stand to leave. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg. He left the watch on her kitchen table and walked out the door. It wasn't an apology. It was something more. He had come to her not with defenses, not with anger, but with stillness, with the humility to sit on her floor and be nothing more than present. And that presence, unspoken and imperfect, echoed louder than any justification could. Maya didn't chase after him, but when she looked at the watch on her table, glinting under the ceiling light, something inside her shifted, not repaired, not forgiven, but moved. James hadn't just returned an heirloom, he had returned truth, and with it, perhaps the beginning of something they didn't yet understand. But for now, it was enough that he had come, that he had stayed. James returned the next morning. There was no text, no warning, just the sound of measured footsteps outside Maya's apartment. She opened the door, expecting silence again, another apology wrapped in hesitation. Instead, he held out a rolled bundle of thick papers. "Blueprints," she realized, clasped tight in his hand. "I want to build a nursery wing," he said without ceremony, as if it were a natural continuation of yesterday's silence. She blinked at him, unsure she'd heard correctly. "A nursery? What?" He stepped inside, unrolling the papers on her small dining table, flattening them with his palm. "For your boys," he said, then corrected himself. "For every child of anyone who works in my house. I can't change what happened last week. Hell, I can't change what happened to you or what I let happen, but I can change that house. I can change what it feels like to walk through its doors." Maya stared at the lines and measurements, the notes scribbled in the margins in his neat handwriting. She didn't know what to say. Not yet. But her fingers reached for the corner of the paper as if needing to confirm it was real. And it was. They sat at her table for over an hour, her coffee growing cold, the blueprints slowly curling at the edges. At some point, James slid a blank grocery receipt across the table and nudged a pen toward her. "Help me design it," he said. "I'm good with code and hardware, but warmth, that's your specialty." She laughed softly, not quite believing him, but picked up the pen anyway. She drew a wide, arching window, then a little bookshelf under it, and finally, instinctively, a rocking chair. He watched, then leaned in and began sketching next to her. Crude stars dotted the ceiling plan, lopsided and sweet. "Glow in the dark," he explained almost sheepishly. "Kids like that, right?" Maya nodded. "Ryan's obsessed with the moon." James smiled. Really smiled. Not the polite executive expression he wore at investor dinners or in magazines, but something fuller, freer. "Then we'll give him one on the ceiling," he said. His hand brushed hers for a fraction of a second. When he reached for the pen again, neither pulled away. It was nothing, and yet not nothing at all. The boys napped nearby on a fleece blanket Maya had laid out, tiny chests rising and falling in unison. Every so often Ryan let out a sigh in his sleep, and James would pause almost reverently to glance over. He asked questions, real ones, about Alex's favorite foods. Ryan's first word, the lullaby Maya sang when they were colicky, and he listened, not with performative interest, but with the absorption of a man gathering missing pieces to a puzzle he hadn't known he needed. "I used to think I'd be a terrible father," he admitted quietly. "I never had a model, and I spent so long focused on building things that I forgot people were what mattered." Maya didn't rush to reassure him. She didn't tell him he was wrong or try to ease his discomfort. She just said, "The fact that you're saying that kind of proves you'd be good at it." James looked at her, then really looked, and the moment held. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was honest, and honesty for both of them had become rarer than gold. As the afternoon wore on, their sketches became messier, more playful. Maya drew a soft corner full of plush toys. James added cubbies labeled with names they made up. Milo, Harper, Zoe. "Future staff babies," he joked. She rolled her eyes but didn't erase them. "What if this is too much?" she asked once, more to herself than him. "What if people say we're crossing lines?" He sat back, expressions sobering but calm. "Let them talk," he said. "They talk anyway. I'd rather be judged for building something good than admired for standing still." The words hung in the air like something she hadn't realized she needed. Not a promise, not a confession, but a choice, a direction. She nodded slowly, a strand of hair falling into her eyes. James reached to tuck it back without thinking, then froze. She didn't move. His hand fell to the table, and they both looked down again, not embarrassed, but a little breathless. This thing between them, undefined, unnamed, was growing faster than either expected. Maya stood to check on the twins, and watching them sleep, felt a surge of something she hadn't let herself feel in months. Possibility. When she turned back, James was folding the blueprints neatly, tucking them into the cardboard tube with deliberate care. "I'll start tomorrow," he said. "The permits, the contractors, it'll take time, but it'll be real." She stepped closer, the receipt still in her hand, now filled with sketches and half-formed dreams. "And what if I'm not there to see it?" she asked. He met her gaze, steady. "Then I'll build it anyway, but I hope you'll come back." For once she didn't deflect. She didn't answer either. Some questions were too big for now, but her silence wasn't rejection. It was consideration, and James understood that. He walked to the door, but paused before opening it. "You made that house warm," he said. "Now I just want to keep it that way." Then he left. The boys slept soundly as Maya sat back down, the grocery receipts still in her hand. Her eyes traced the stars James had drawn. They were crooked, imperfect, and real. That mattered. It was the first time she had seen James laugh from his chest, not just his throat, full and unguarded. Something inside her cracked open too. She didn't say it out loud, not even to herself. But as she laid the paper beside the blueprints and looked at her sons, still peacefully dreaming, she felt it flicker. Hope not wild or reckless, but slow and cautious. Maybe, just maybe, this could be safe. The morning began like most others, since Maya had returned to the Harrison estate, quiet, steady, a new rhythm still forming. James had taken to starting his days in the garden, a habit unfamiliar to him until recently. It wasn't about the flowers or the sun. It was about the calm, the way the boys' giggles punctuated the stillness, like soft reminders that life had returned to this place. Maya was nearby, hanging laundry under the slanted light of mid-morning, her eyes flicking to the boys every few seconds. Alex, ever the bolder of the two, waddled away from her reach, unsteady but determined. James, crouched by a hedge inspecting a broken irrigation pipe, didn't notice the toddler approaching until he felt tiny fingers clutch his pants leg. Then came the sound, clear, unmistakable, almost too real for something so small. Da, the words, sliced the air like lightning, unexpected and blinding. James went still, completely still. Maya, halfway through folding a shirt, froze. Her breath caught in her throat. For a second, no one moved. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, buzzing, alive with shock and something deeper. Maya opened her mouth, then closed it. She took a slow step forward, her voice soft but sure, like a parent explaining the unexplainable. "He doesn't know," she murmured, her eyes darting between James and her son, who now giggled and pressed his face into James's knee. "He doesn't understand what that means." But her words sounded fragile, even to her own ears, because wasn't that the hardest part? That children sometimes knew things adults hadn't yet dared to accept. James blinked as if surfacing from underwater. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to the ground, knees creaking against the stone path, and opened his arms. Alex tumbled forward, collapsing into his chest with a gleeful laugh. James gathered him in, hands awkward and reverent. He held the boy like something precious, something not yet his, but deeply important. "Maybe he does," he whispered into the boy's hair. His voice was, but it didn't shake. Maya stood only a few feet away, arms crossed tightly, but her eyes shimmered. She didn't speak again. There were no right words. They stayed like that for a long while. James on the ground with Alex curled into his lap. Ryan soon waddling over, with interest and climbing into the pile without hesitation. Maya didn't interrupt. She simply watched, observed the ease with which her son settled against this man, the one whose house had once felt like a fortress of ice. James looked up at her briefly, meeting her gaze with something raw in his expression. He was overwhelmed, but not running. That in itself was new. "Do they call anyone else that?" he asked gently, not accusingly. "Da," Maya shook her head. "No," she said. "Never." He nodded, eyes lowering again to the boys, who now babbled nonsense as they poked at the buttons of his shirt. "I'm not sure I deserve it," he said. "Not to her, maybe not to anyone, but I don't want them to stop." The confession was so simple, so startling in its honesty, that Maya had to look away for a second. Her heart thudded behind her ribs like a warning or a prayer, maybe both. Later that day, after lunch and diaper changes and tiny feet running, laps around the hallway, the boys finally napped, one on the sofa, the other curled on a pillow James had set on the rug. Maya made tea, and James lingered in the doorway like he wanted to say something more. But he didn't. He only watched them sleep, as if trying to memorize the stillness. That evening, Maya returned to her quarters early. She needed space, not distance, not coldness, just air, time to sit with what had happened. That word, that look, that quiet exchange in the garden. She didn't regret anything, but her mind swirled with questions she hadn't been ready to ask herself. Was this temporary? Was it kindness mistaken for something deeper? Was she once again letting herself hope for more than what was offered? James hadn't made promises, and she hadn't asked for any. But today, something shifted, and once things shift, they don't unshift. That's what scared her most. James, however, didn't sleep right away. That night, as he passed the guest wing to return to his room, he paused at the nursery blueprint tacked to the wall outside the playroom. His fingers brushed over the corner of the page, tracing Maya's handwriting. Moon corner for Ryan. Book nook for Alex. He smiled quietly, wistfully, and continued on. When he entered his bedroom, something caught his eye on the nightstand. A photo. It hadn't been there that morning. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hands. It was grainy, slightly out of focus, but unmistakable himself crouched in the living room with Ryan and Alex clinging to him. Someone, probably. Maya had captured the moment without him noticing. On the back, in neat handwriting, were just a few words, but they stopped him cold. Home is what you build, not what you inherit. The nursery was finished, and it didn't look like something born from architectural plans or contractor meetings. It looked lived in before a single child had even stepped foot inside. Walls painted in soft, playful hues, shelves stocked with storybooks worn from second-hand stores, not catalogues, a rocking chair that Maya had picked from a yard sale and refinished herself, and ceiling stars that James had hand-cut and glued while the twins napped in a makeshift playpen beside him. What was once a sterile corridor filled with portraits of James's ancestors had transformed into a wing humming with colour, memory, and presence. The transition hadn't come with fanfare. It was quiet, gradual, like the first breath after grief, like light through drawn curtains. The boys toddled through the hallway in mismatched socks, leaving behind trails of toys and laughter, which no one asked them to pick up. James found himself stepping on Legos and not minding. Maya found herself smiling without fear of what the next moment might demand. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation, had begun to feel like what neither of them had dared to name, a home. Victoria had left 2 weeks before, her exit absent of drama or confrontation. No slammed doors, no cruel remarks, just silence. She had come to win back something that no longer belonged to her, only to realize it had never truly been hers to begin with. James didn't stop her when she left. He didn't feel anger or even relief, just finality, like a chapter closing with the quiet turn of a page. What replaced her presence was not triumph, but peace, the kind that only comes when you stop defending what no longer serves you. The house had once been a fortress meant to keep pain out, but now it was a sanctuary that let love in. The staff felt it too. Laughter returned to the halls, not just from the children, but from the people who had once walked on eggshells. There was music in the kitchen, shared meals in the courtyard, and moments of stillness between people who no longer feared being seen. Maya didn't ask for control. She never did. But her presence anchored something in all of them. She had not just moved into the house. She had woken it. The celebration was small, almost incidental. A gathering in the newly finished nursery wing. Just staff and a few friends who had stayed loyal through James's colder years. No photographers, no reporters, no champagne towers, just paper plates, a cake from the local bakery, and streamers Alex had chewed through during setup. James stood near the doorway, a mug of coffee in hand instead of a wine glass, watching the people who had made this change possible, not through plans or strategy, but through love, patience, and presence. When it came time to speak, he didn't clear his throat or raise his voice. He simply looked at Maya, who was laughing softly with Ryan, balanced on her hip, and began. "I've made a lot of speeches in my life," he said, voice steady, Boardrooms, conferences, deals worth more than this house. But I've never said thank you when it mattered most." The room fell quiet. "Maya," he continued, "you didn't just care for this house. You reminded it how to feel. You reminded me how to feel." The words didn't need embellishment. She looked up, startled, but moved. And in that look, James felt more than gratitude. He felt forgiveness, not just from her, but from himself. Later, after the guests had gone, and the twins had finally surrendered to sleep beneath the mobile they had helped hang, stars swaying gently from threads James had twisted himself, he found Maya in the kitchen, cleaning bottles. She looked up as he entered, but didn't speak. There was no need. He stood beside her, not brushing against her, but close enough to feel the gravity between them. He placed one hand on the counter, the other holding 2 mugs of tea. She accepted one without hesitation. They stood like that for minutes, drinking in silence. Then he said it, quiet but certain. "You don't have to go. Not tonight. Not anymore." He didn't look at her as he said it, afraid that looking might shatter the courage he'd mustered. But she didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed her mug down, turned to him fully, and rested her hand on his. No words, no theatrics, just a touch that said everything. His heart skipped, but this time he didn't retreat. He leaned in, and for the first time, his body didn't flinch from connection. It welcomed it. Nothing had been erased. Her grief for her husband, his wounds from Victoria, the shadows left behind by the years. They were all still there. But they no longer held the final word. The past didn't rule them. It simply informed who they had become. What mattered now was the space they were building, not just for themselves, but for the boys, for the staff, for anyone who stepped through the doors of that once lonely house. James didn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He only made space, emotional, physical, real, for them to stay, to grow, to breathe. Maya, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like she had to measure her worth by her resilience. She could simply be, and James could simply be with her. No performance, no masks. Just 2 people who had once been broken, now sitting side by side in the quiet, choosing to rebuild. As the night settled around them, and the last light flickered off in the nursery, the mansion didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt alive. There were new sounds now. Alex's sleepy murmurs, Ryan's laugh muffled against a stuffed bear, the clink of 2 mugs left on the counter, the rustle of a blanket as Maya curled onto the couch beside James without a single word. These weren't the echoes of loneliness that had once haunted the walls. They were proof of presence, of life shared, of people who stayed. The house, once frozen in time, now pulsed with it. Not just because children ran through its halls, or because paint had been refreshed or furniture moved, but because trust had been built slowly, painfully, honestly, the kind of trust that makes a place sacred, and so the house breathed, and everyone in it finally felt alive. If this story moved you in any way, we truly love to hear what it meant to you in the comments. We put a lot of care and time into creating each video. Sometimes it takes over a week to bring a single story to life. Your support makes all the difference. By subscribing to the channel, you're helping us continue sharing stories that touch the heart and bring people together. And if you enjoyed this one, feel free to explore more of our videos. There's so much waiting for you here. Thank you for watching, for being here, and for sharing a few quiet moments with us. Your presence means more than you know.